just want to introduce Mike Safford. He is the Vineyard Area Regional Pastor, and he's been a great resource to the board that we've gotten to know him. I got to meet him in person today, which was great. And he's got a great message for us today, and we're excited to have him here with us.
It's very likely that I've not met most of you. Again, my name is Mike Safford. I pastor a church in a city called Tehachapi, California. Has anyone ever been to Tehachapi? You ever heard that name before? Tehachapi. Hard to say. No one really knows what it means. When we first moved there, my son called it Patachahu for the first several months. Couldn't nail it down. If you are going from the Central Coast to Las Vegas, how many of you are willing to admit that you do that sometimes? Those are my people right there. I love it. Yeah. When you do that, you're en route to Vegas. You go through Tehachapi. We're thrilled to come up and spend time. We've known of this church for many years in the different iterations and seasons and journeys that this church has been a part of. We've always known of what was Mountain Brook is now Arise. You are, whether you've known this or whether you've heard this terminology before or not, maybe you're newer to the context of kind of the season that the community here is in. You are a Vineyard church. If you're not familiar with the Vineyard is a community of churches that really now is worldwide, kind of arose during the Jesus People movement. How many of you are products of the Jesus People movement? How many of you met Jesus in the Jesus People movement? I was born in the Jesus People movement. There were a community of churches, a couple different kinds of communities of churches. Chuck Smith and Calvary Chapel emerged in that season, began to coalesce around his leadership, and now there are Calvary Chapel communities all around the world. Vineyard in similar fashion. John Wimber was the founder of Vineyard Churches. He was one of the members of the Righteous Brothers. Do you remember that? Does that contextually make sense anymore? You've lost that love and feeling. Should I sing the whole thing? No? No one cares? Jose, you want to come up and sing it for me real quick? Good to see you, dude. So the Vineyard is now a community of churches, all these years removed, worldwide, about 3,000 churches. Here in the United States, little over 500. In Southern California, which in the Vineyard we demarcate as being from just south of San Francisco, which I don't know why we do this, down to the Mexican border. I know no self-respecting San Josean who would call themselves a Southern Californian, but regardless, we are the SoCal region. We have within the footprint of that geography, about 65 churches. And so one of the things that I do along with pastoring our church in Tehachapi, for years prior to that, my wife Liz and I were a part of a vineyard church called the Anaheim Vineyard down in Yorba Linda, Anaheim Hills, California. We've been in Tehachapi the last 5.5 years, and along with that, we oversee the 65 churches that we have in SoCal. I want to just be really straightforward with you about my role in this season. I want to say that I think Bryce and the rest of the team, the board that oversees kind of ecclesial health, institutional kind of fiscal responsibility, the structure of the church here, I think they're doing a spectacular job. I know and have gotten to know over many, many Zoom conversations and phone calls with them in the last couple months, their heart and desire to see health and vitality and really the next leg of the journey of what this community is and is called by God to be. I've also been in regular dialogue with Rick Olmsted, and if you haven't met him yet, he's the guy that was just up on the video. And as Bryce just announced, I want to say that I think that's a really healthy decision for this community in this season. Rick, I know he doesn't look it, but he's actually 114 years old. He's led in the Vineyard for a very, very long time, where he's fortunate he has Becky, his beautiful, lovely, talented leadership stud of a wife who has led not only alongside him, but in her own right for years and years. And we have known, Liz and I have known Becky and Rick, we have known the Olmsteds for years now to be leaders of integrity, intentionality, purpose. They have led successfully. They have grown large churches. They have launched somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 vineyard churches. They're not new to the dynamic of what it means to do local church. And I am thrilled for their leadership and your cooperative participation as a community over this next leg of the journey as you guys transition in this season. Liz and I hung out. This is Liz, by the way. She's my wife. And we were hanging out with Rick for a little bit on Friday when we got into town here in, down in San Luis Obispo. We spent yesterday driving up the coast. We've never done this. I'm born and raised San Diego, right? Jesus' favorite team is the Padres. We all know that. We won't go any further on that. Born and raised in San Diego, lived there till I was 21, relocated to Orange County, where I went on staff as an intern pastor at the then Anaheim Vineyard, and we have pastored and led in vineyard churches in Los Angeles County, San Diego County, Orange County ever since. Yesterday was the very first time we ever got to drive the Central Coast. We had never been further north than, where are all the things laying out on the sand that make the noise and they throw sand on themselves? San Simeon. We'd never been higher than that, further north than that. So yesterday we're like, let's drive. And we're like, we'll go to Big Sur. Never been to Big Sur. Always wanted to go to Big Sur. So we started driving that direction. You cannot actually go to Big Sur because it's like life-threateningly dangerous to drive up there. Did you guys know that? Like the road falls into the ocean. Have you ever seen that before? I didn't. In San Diego, that doesn't happen to our roads. We just kind of stay nice and healthy at 72 degrees. Great. I got to say, I've never seen a more beautiful stretch of earth than what we saw yesterday. What a stunning part of the world this is. What a stunning part of the world you guys live in. And might I suggest that Jesus has you here in his own timing and by his own decision making at just the right time. Just the right time, knowing exactly what he's doing and what he intends to do, not only with your narrative, but the narrative of this church. Rick on Friday, when he was talking to us about not driving to Big Sur and valuing life, choose life is one of my mottos, so we made it all the way up to where they had closed the road, turned around and came back. He said that what he's been talking about here the last few weeks is God's unstoppable church, and I think that's a spectacular topic. And I want to say this morning that the church is unstoppable because it's the primary work of the Holy Spirit. It's the primary thing he's up to and doing amongst you. Here's the way that Jesus uses this kind of contextually in Matthew 16. This won't come up on the screen or anything. And I tell you, Jesus, as he's speaking with Peter, that you are Peter. The Aramaic is Cephas, that translates in the Greek to Petros, where we get Peter. It simply means rock. It says, and on this rock, I will, that's emphatic language, right? That's not like I might, or I'm going to try, or maybe. He says very bluntly, I will build my church. And he doubles down on the affectability of that building that he's going to do. He says, and the gates of Hades, which would have been a contextual way of essentially saying the kingdom that is opposed to the kingdom of God, that it will, in a sense, make an attempt to stop this work, but Jesus is blatant, straightforward in his terminology. He says, it will fail. I will build my church. Our friends and brothers and sisters in the footprint of the Roman Catholic ecclesiology very much personalized that this was Peter's kind of inauguration as the first great leader of the church. But might I suggest to you that Jesus isn't speaking about a person, he's speaking about a type of person. He's not speaking specifically about a man, he's speaking about a type of people and the kind of person, the kind of community, might I say the kind of church community upon which Jesus will do this work of making out of this whatever he intends, whatever he desires to bring about. This morning, I want to speak with you briefly about how you and I, in our participation in community and in our own journeys, can posture ourselves to participate with the work that Jesus is actively engaged in right now. The shape of that participation, I think, is seen most clearly in the first two chapters of Mark's gospel. And we're not going to go through the entirety of chapters 1 and 2 of Mark's gospel, but we're going to take a little part and land there this morning from which we'll draw a couple ideas. But just contextually for Mark's gospel, it's the oldest gospel that we have. It was the first of the narrative. The friends around Jesus begin writing down and putting into touchable form the things that Jesus did, what he taught, what he had done amongst us. And Mark opens his gospel very, very purposefully with this charismatic figure that arrives on the scene, very much in the posture of the Old Testament prophet. This is a purposeful link from one season to another. What God had been doing in what arena and what he will now do in the next arena. And in this figure, John the Baptist, he puts the voice of Isaiah the prophet, who had lived some 700 years before, just before Israel was carried out into captivity by the Babylonian Empire. And Isaiah's call some 700 years before was what he now puts in the mouth of John the Baptist, and it's this, quote, "A voice of one calling in the desert, make straight paths for the Lord." Make straight paths for the Lord. What I'd like to draw our attention to briefly here at the onset is notice that Isaiah's invitation is not make your way to where God is. I want you to start moving very purposefully toward that distant spot where God is currently postured, and I want you to double up on your effort, your holiness, your capability. Start strategizing for how you're going to move from A to B. Rather, his invitation is very blunt. Am I being too loud? I have a tendency to be verbose and to yell a little bit. My wife is the only truth teller in the building. She just nodded at me. I also spit a lot, so I'm grateful you're sitting about 30 feet back. Notice Isaiah's invitation is not make your way to where God is, but rather do not obstruct his movement toward you. Mark is highlighting for us one of the primary themes that's found all throughout the whole arc of Scripture, from the very beginning narrative all the way through to the end of Revelation. God is always moving toward you, no matter what season you find yourself in and how much it feels like he is or not. There's an author called Paula Darcy, and she put it this way: right now, God is moving toward you disguised as your real life. He's near, moving toward you. And the very first narrative we're given in Genesis is the fall of humanity. And what do Adam and Eve do? They hide. God shows up on the scene, says he came walking in the cool of the day, right? Giving the picture that around the same time every day they would sit and commune and participate one with another. And he shows up for their regular appointment, if you want to use that kind of terminology, and they are not there. He knows full well that they are around the corner, third bush from the left, right? He knows exactly where they are. But here's the rhetorical question that he asks: Adam, where are you? Where'd you go? The whole narrative that's being put forward is this is going to be the shape of the relationship between God and humanity from here to forevermore. God will move toward you where you are. He knows exactly the shape of where you currently are and what he intends to do with you, and he is moving toward you such as life currently is. The question you and I are faced with in any season is this: will we cooperate with that movement, or will we obstruct it? In his gospel, Mark will identify for us the kinds of things that serve as obstructions to the movement that's happening right now of God moving toward us where we currently are. Mark chapter 1, those obstructions, we're not going to read any of this, but you can go back and look later. Mark 1, the obstructions that are noted there by the gospel writer are the obstructions that happen to us. Spiritual attack. He casts out a demon. Physical healings. He begins to heal the masses. Lepers who were social pariahs, told you don't belong, you cannot participate, you have to live outside of the footprint of where everyone else finds themselves. Jesus went and walked amongst the leper colonies and began to bring healing from the obstructions that had been done to them. Things have happened to you that are unfair. I don't need to know your story to already know that. I could give my list, my wife's list, of things that have happened to us that are existentially unfair. But that's not where Mark is going to center his attention. Where he's going to really center his attention is this. Mark chapter 2 goes through a litany of obstructions that happen because of us. There's things that we do that put hills and mountains in front of us instead of making straight paths for the Lord. And when we think of that, if I were to say this morning, there are things happening right now in and around your life, not only as a community of people, but as individual followers of Jesus. There are things happening right now that serve as obstructions that happen because of you, not to you, to God moving toward your life. Most of us, if I were going to say, what is that? Most of us would quickly be drawn toward that one sin we particularly struggle with, or a series of sins. That's where we tend to go. I'm failing. I'm not hitting the mark. You may know that the Hebrew word for sin literally is an archery term, meaning I'm aiming at the mark and I'm missing it. So because of my failure, God is unable to move on straight paths toward where I find myself right now. It's my fault. And that resonates with us because we live in full awareness of our faults. How many of us did something naughty in the last couple of days? I'm looking at you, Jose. Come on now. But the Gospels repeatedly show Jesus moving toward rather than away from those mired in sin. You understand the narrative of the Gospels. One of the primary criticisms about Jesus is he hung out with the wrong crowd. He spent time with, he communed with, he broke bread with. He was ensconced around sinners, people that didn't deserve, hadn't done good enough to kind of like lower the hills and the mountains and make straight paths for the Lord. The Gospels repeatedly show Jesus moving toward rather than away from those with sin. So sin doesn't seem to be the answer of what's keeping you from making straight paths for the Lord. What the Gospels show is that self-imposed obstructions to God's presence and movement toward our lives seem to come from our misplaced religious devotion or trying hard to do the right thing in the wrong way. How many of you know that Jesus expresses overt, calculable anger 6 times in the Gospels? You want to take a guess which crowd he gets angry with in every single instance? It's not the young woman who's like struggling in her life and trying to make her way and super broken and got the wrong relationships. It's paid religious professionals like myself. It's people who are devoted. They've said yes, a robust yes to God. They want God. They're moving toward God. But what Mark 2 is pointing out is that in that religious devotion, that intentionality, that desire to do the right thing, engage God, move toward God, we are actually setting up obstructions that prevent God from engaging the reality of where we are now. Trying hard to do the right thing in the wrong way. The obstructions noted here in Mark 2 come from well-intentioned, devout people. They are challenging his forgiving posture towards sin. They're challenging why he hangs out with the wrong crowd. They're challenging why he seems lackadaisical about spiritual disciplines, et cetera, it goes on and on. They love God, but in their well-intentioned devotion are actually obstructing what he's bringing toward their lives. They're actually stopping what God is asking them to clear the path for him to bring into where they are, and they're doing it by their religious devotion to God. This was such a routine encounter for Jesus that near the very end of his life, the Gospels note, in Luke's in particular, him openly lamenting it, or near his friends praying out loud these words. As he approached, this is Luke 19, as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. Jesus begins, wept textually in Scripture. Doesn't mean to get the sniffles like we might have, if we're like watching a great movie. Remember at the end of Braveheart when he screams freedom and you all started getting a little, no one? No one at all? Okay. This community truly needs discipleship at a more intense level. So what we're talking about is open lamenting, open wailing, right? Snotty crying, loud crying. Well, I think they call it ugly crying, right? Jesus wept over it and said, listen to his words, quote, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you and your enemies will build an embankment against you, encircle you, hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. This happened when the Roman Empire toppled Jerusalem between 68 and 70 AD. But here's how Jesus closes this lament. He says, they will not leave one stone on another because, listen, you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. God was moving toward you. God was in your life, present to your story. It didn't feel like God to you, but it was. And because you did not see it, you could not grab it, you did not make straight paths, the events that were experienced happened instead. What Mark wants us to see in 2024 in San Luis Obispo, California, and Tehachapi, California, places like that, is that God's desire for you is not get better at moving toward God, but rather do not obstruct his movement toward you. Make straight paths for the Lord. I want to consider very briefly 3 things today that can serve as well-intentioned obstructions to the movement of God in our lives. And the text that we're going to use is Mark 2:18 through 22. So if you have a Bible or an app, I think it might come up on the screen behind us here. You can follow along. Here's what Mark writes in this obstruction to God moving toward us. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, the spiritual discipline of going without food for anywhere from 24 hours to 7 days. Some people came and asked Jesus, quote, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not doing what all the good religious people are doing, what they're supposed to do? Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them, but the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one, Jesus continues with this weird allegorical kind of like double down on what he's saying. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wine skins will be ruined. No, he pours new wine into new wine skins. I want to suggest to the collective we this morning, as a church, but also as individuals navigating your own story with God, that this text gives us in thumbnail sketch form 3 things that you and I routinely do, and I want to be really clear, I'm including myself in that, routinely do that obstruct God's movement toward us and do not cause us to hear the voice of one calling in the desert, make straight paths for the Lord. Obstruction number 1 that I want to point out is our expectations. How many of you, by show of hands, has life gone for you these last 10 years exactly the way that you anticipated? Okay, excellent. I'm glad to see that most of us are truth tellers in the building this morning. In verse 18, they, the Pharisaical crowd and John's disciples, challenge why Jesus is not doing what they expect him to. You're supposed to be fasting. The crew around you that you're leading, They are supposed to be doing this normative posture that all good lovers of God do, and they are driven by a defined expectation. So as God is in the act of moving toward them, standing before them, they are rejecting it out of hand because it does not meet their preformed expectations of what God will or will not do. Friends, I know that's a big mouthful, and I tend to be fairly verbose. I'm not great at narrowing things down. Let me be blunt about this. They missed God when he was standing in front of them because of what they expected God was supposed to come and do and look like. Might I suggest that you and I do this all of the time? All of the time. It's important to know about expectations. They are awful measuring sticks for whether God is actually in something, because our expectations are formed within the small confines of our limited perspective. My first, that I can remember, identifiable, feelable experience with this idea of expectation came from when I was a very young pastor. I know that I look really young and svelte and attractive. I'm not. I'm an old man. I'm 49. I was born in 1975 when I was much younger. And not old, I'm old. I mean, you might be older, but you're young in body, spirit. God bless you. I'm super happy for you. For me, I can feel it all breaking down, right? So when I was very, very young, I went to a workshop, this kind of like gathering at a conference down at this church, Vineyard Anaheim. And there was a guy at the time by the name of Todd Hunter, who's now an Anglican bishop. He at the time was the national director of Vineyard Churches. That's another story for another day, but I vividly remember him saying in this workshop that I was in, kind of a room like this, a little smaller, crowd like you, and he looked and he said these words: "If you want to matter in the vineyard, you will plant a church." And I was 21, very young, idealistic, deeply wanting to matter, to do something that would cause effect in the culture around me. And I wanted to be seen as strongly capable. And I remember in that moment when he said that, on a morning like this, I remember vividly thinking, well, I want to matter. Therefore, I will plant a church. So I set myself toward a goal in that very early day. This is what I'm going to do to honor God and impact the world around me. I'm going to plant a church. Fast forward a few years later, I've met Liz. We got married. We're living in a place called Santa Clarita. We're on staff at a church called the Santa Clarita Vineyard. Long story, but I'm praying one morning. And we've been there for a couple years. It's really clear. It's time to go ahead and get ready to plant a church. We didn't know where to go. We were trying to figure out between, and I know this sounds like a weird kind of conglomeration of spots. We were praying about Thousand Oaks, San Diego, and the greater London area in the UK. And I was like, I know that sounds weird. I was like God, and I was lamenting for days and days and days. God, just speak to me. Just tell me, maybe one of you, maybe some of you are considering moving to other areas, looking for a particular job. You want a spouse, whatever that is, and you're praying, God, just reveal it, show me, say something, do something, point out. That's the way I was praying. And one particular morning, I was praying, and I was reading Psalm 1, which talks about the kind of person God will bless. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked and stand in the way of sin, et cetera, et cetera. And what it goes on to say is everything he does prospers. Everything he does. And in that moment, it was in a Denny's of all places. You guys know that Jesus speaks in Denny's, right? And so I'm sitting there, and in clear as a bell, I feel like the Lord says this: Mike, stop worrying about where. If you take the posture of this kind of man, wherever you choose to go, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to cause you to prosper. And in that moment, sitting there in Denny's, I just knew I want to go back to my home, San Diego. I want to go back to where I had done great damage to people. People had done great damage to me. I want to restore the years the locusts have stolen. I want to go to San Diego. And so fast forward, a couple years later, we're living in San Diego. My wife and myself and 6 other super courageous people packed up, moved to San Diego, didn't know anyone, started knocking on doors, started getting jobs, inviting. Fast forward a couple more years, or about a year, we've got 150 people gathered. We're cranking, everything is going high to the right. And I feel, as a 26-year-old man, like everything is going the way it's supposed to. What I expected. I have done what God has asked. And God is holding up his end of the bargain. He is prospering me. Right around that time, our second child is born. He's now like that tall, I don't know, he's like young, super fit. He's called Jacob. He's 20 years old. He's working at a vineyard church. He's a great young man, right? Right about that time, he's born. And 4 months into his young little baby squishy, we used to call him Jacob the Hutt because he just was this ball of contiguous fat. He was just this thing, right? 4-month baby checkup, they said, your son has a very serious form of infantile cancer. And we don't know what to tell you about what his outlook looks like. So as it would be for anyone, that would be very difficult news to swallow, right? Liz went into mama mode, started caring for and loving on him. My perspective, my expectation was to say, wait a second, God, what is this? You told me that if I did A, B, and C, if I set myself in a particular direction that looked like this, you would prosper me. And that all bubbled up. We're talking over the course of like 72 hours. Liz was at the hospital. I came back to our apartment. We had another little baby girl, little one called Alexa at the time before it was cool to be called Alexa. And I put her to bed, and I'm laying on mine and Liz's bed in our apartment. And all of that frustration and anger and expectation culminated in out loud me looking at the ceiling and saying to God, you lied to me. You lied to me. You told me you would prosper me. But my question all these years later that I think is helpful for me, it might be for you, is did he really lie to me? What I didn't know in that moment is that God lying to me was in actuality me simply coming into conflict with the limited nature of my own expectations. In that raw moment of pain and disillusionment, God responded verbally. So right after I screamed at the ceiling, you lied to me, you call this prospering? An audible voice, the way you hear my voice right now, did not sound like James Earl Jones, did not sound like Darth Vader, just sounded like a dude, right? Said from my right, which was in the bathroom, I'm not sure why God was in the bathroom, right? Duty calls. Said out loud, right after I screamed at the ceiling, finally, Michael, now we can really talk. Finally, Michael, now we can really talk. He did not chastise me. He did not defend himself. He did not try to explain why he had failed me. Instead, he said simply, finally, now we are at a place where you and I can dialogue. He responded to me as though my crisis was a good thing, that I had arrived in a good space. Friends, can I be honest with you? It did not feel like a good space. It very clearly was the wrong spot, and here I am laying on my bed screaming at God. And his response was, ooh, I like this. I assumed that my pain was God abandoning me. But in reality, my disillusionment was the necessary environment to recalibrate my understanding of what prospering actually looks like, which had much less to do with my success as a young church planter and much more to do with the development of the man I was becoming. I am who I am today because of a season I would have called the failure of God. Here's a kingdom truth for all of us, I think, to hold on to, especially in moments where things don't feel like they're going the right way, If God told you the plan ahead of time, you would not go. But on the other side, you would not exchange it for anything. And friends, I want to be clear with you. Every big leader in the vineyard that I've sat around for the last 30 years, I have seen that same truth be true for them individually and for their churches. That when we are convinced God has made a wrong turn or is not going the right way, on the other side of that environ, they would not exchange it for anything. When God does not meet your expectations, consider that it may be the formative grace of God challenging the obstruction of limited expectations in your life. Number 2, and I have about 4 minutes, so I'll get through the last 2 quickly, I promise. You don't need to be concerned. Obstruction number 2, losing sight of the main thing. In verses 19 and 20 of this text, Jesus identifies the end goal of that which we do for God is simply intimacy with God. In this case, fasting, which is a means of intimacy with God, which is the goal or the main thing, had subtly become the main thing itself. Our pursuit of God and what we do for God can very easily move from being a means of intimacy to the main thing that we do. All that God has given you to steward or to do for him. So for those here at this church, this beautiful property, look out those windows. Look at all that you have. Look what God has entrusted to you, given to you to steward. All that God has given you to steward or do for him is only meant to cultivate intimate union with him. Freedom, flat spaces for him to move in and say, here's what I want to do with you and with all of this in this season. And anytime it becomes the focus in its own right, this is what this needs to look like. This is how many people need to be in this building. This is the view we need to see. This is what the experience is supposed to be like. Anytime we're forcing that construct, that framework, anytime it becomes the focus in its own right and for its own sake, it becomes a hindrance or obstruction to God's movement in our lives. Another way to say it might be, if you're doing anything for reasons other than being connected and alive with God himself in intimacy, we can be obstructing God. Eric Liddell, the Scottish Olympian, said, the reason I run, did you see the movie Chariots of Fire? Does anyone watch that anymore? You guys remember that? Bum, 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 bum. I would model it, but I don't want to cause anyone to stumble. So Eric said, this is why he said he runs. I run because when I run, I feel God's pleasure. I come alive. I don't do it for the acclaim or for the accolade. I don't do it for the awards or the medals. I do it because there's something compelling in me. I think God has shaped me to do this. And when I do it, I experience intimacy with God. With what you're doing in this season, friends, with or for God, do you feel his pleasure, or has it grown stale, tired, old? It might be that in seasons like that, the thing that is not supposed to be the main thing has instead become the main thing. And Jesus might be saying, I want you to again remember that I am the main thing. For me, church planting, while looking holy on the outside, was a means of egoic success, mattering, prospering, proving my worth. This holy looking thing had become an obstruction to me actually being receptive toward and responsive to God. And his grace to break through that came from the worst possible thing I could ever imagine. The worst thing that had happened to me became veiled grace for God to say, I want you to keep the main thing, the main thing. We must ask ourselves routinely, is what I'm doing for God actually focused on the main thing? And finally, obstruction number 3 that we see in this text is living in yesterday. In verses 21 and 22, Jesus concludes his warning on obstructions with a seemingly cryptic challenge about old cloth and new wineskins not playing well together. What he's doing here is he's addressing the temptation to define what God will do today and tomorrow based on what he had done yesterday. Friends, we are incredibly prone to this. Yesterday for us feels safe because it's definable, it's certain, it's knowable. We know how to quantify it. Even if it was a hard season, we can touch its moving parts. We know what it was. It is not veiled in mystery. The known and the experienced can become a rigid framework by which we accept or reject what we're seeing in real time and space right now. But Jesus uses aggressively strong image here. He says, listen, things will tear, burst, be destroyed. He's saying, listen, friends, do not do this. This was the same lesson he taught Israel with the manna. Remember the one rule he gave them about manna? Get up in the morning, go collect what you need, and do not save any. And of course, they thought, well, that was a solid suggestion, but I would like to have my Pop-Tarts ready to go the next morning when I wake up, right? So what do they inevitably do? They inevitably go and save some for tomorrow, and when they open it up to use it, what has happened to it? It has rotted. It is putrid. It is no longer available to sustain the moment that they're currently in. What he's saying is that yesterday and its definableness is a bad metric for what God will do today, because God is alive and leading in real time and never thrown by any circumstance you find awkward or unnavigatable. He is leading as he sees fit for this moment. And what he did yesterday and what he gave yesterday and the grace he apportioned yesterday will not suffice for what you need in this moment now. Aliveness by nature will mean newness, unpredictability, twists, turns, surprises. If you find yourself never surprised by God, you are likely living on yesterday's manna than what he's given you for this moment now, which means memory, history, the definableness of your story has become central rather than intimacy in real space and time. God intends that we live aware of the past, but within the framework of the living now. Yesterday's grace will rot quickly or wear thin and burst because we're not intended to live tied to the certainty of what has happened, but to be in the untamed and immediate now with the living God for what he wants to cause to happen. To avoid change, newness, and surprise is to obstruct what God is doing today. Let me suggest, friends, in my conversations with Rick, with the board, with people that are familiar with the story, the narrative that God's been cultivating amongst you here at this church, it's very, very clear that you are in a new season. And in your own lives, in your own stories, what God has done with you, where he's brought you from and where he's taking you to, Jesus has not forgotten how to lead. It may be different than where you thought it would be. It may feel like what I'm trying to do to hold on to things is look at these like identifiable functional moving pieces, like for the Pharisees, fasting, and we're making something else the main thing instead of the intimate connection, union with Jesus in real space and time. Or we might be holding on to what God did yesterday and using that as a template for how that has to look today or tomorrow. Friends, in real space and time, the resurrected Jesus, the Nazarene, is leading your felt life and this community and knows precisely where he intends to take it. He's not ad-libbing. He's not making it up as he goes. He's not shifting because of something you've done wrong. He is leading for today. And I am incredibly confident that he is an incredible leader and knows exactly what he intends to engender and to take forward in you as individuals and a community of people. Would you stand? And if the worship team could come back out. Would you bow your heads? Hi, Jesse. Father, I ask that as we wrap up this morning, I think appropriately so, with turning our faces toward you and worshiping you, I ask that in the way only you can, you would, by your sovereign Father's heart, speak to each one here, verbalize about their story, their expectations, what they've made the main thing, how they look back in their story to quantify what the next leg of the journey can or will or should look like. I pray that you meet us on the ground that we're in. We're doing our best this morning, Jesus, to make straight paths for you. Would you move toward us? Would you speak? Would you instruct? Would you tell us what you intend in our story, in our lives, in this beautiful local faith community? Would you have your way? We acquiesce to that, Jesus, this morning the best we know how. Come, Holy Spirit, and as we worship you, speak to your people.